What happens when a fearless FBI agent uncovers a deadly web of corruption, only to be betrayed by someone she trusts? Maya Carter's relentless pursuit of justice leads her to shocking truths, dangerous alliances, and a fight for survival. As a hidden syndicate closes in, can she expose the truth before it's too late? Or will the forces of power and betrayal silence her forever? Watch now to uncover the twists, the betrayals, and the fight for justice that will leave you on the edge of your seat. The streets of Atlanta buzzed with the life of a typical weekday afternoon. Cars inched forward in stop-and-go traffic, their drivers weary but eager to make it home. Among them, FBI Special Agent Maya Carter sat behind the wheel of her black sedan, her mind far from the chaos of the city. Maya was one of the brightest stars in the Bureau, having spent the past several months on an undercover investigation targeting a powerful crime syndicate. Today, after weeks of grueling effort, she'd finally secured the intel she needed to connect the organization to a series of high-profile crimes. Her heart swelled with a mixture of pride and exhaustion. For Maya, the stakes of her job were always high, but they were personal too. Being a black woman in the FBI had never been easy, and every small victory felt like a battle won against a world that doubted her. She was replaying the details of her latest findings in her mind when the sudden flash of blue and red lights in her rearview mirror jolted her back to reality. The shrill wail of a siren followed. Confused, she glanced at her speedometer. She wasn't speeding, nor had she run a light. There was no apparent reason for her to be stopped. Taking a steadying breath, she signaled and pulled over to the side of the road. The cruiser parked behind her, and in the rearview mirror, Maya saw a tall, broad-shouldered officer stepping out, his hand resting ominously on the holster of his gun. The bold white letters on his uniform read, APD. Maya adjusted her rearview mirror for a better look. His expression was hard and unreadable, his strides deliberate and authoritative. Something about his demeanor sent a chill down her spine, but she maintained her composure. When the officer reached her window, she rolled it down and greeted him politely. "Good afternoon, officer. Is there a problem?" The man glanced at her briefly before barking, "License and registration." His tone was clipped, almost dismissive. The name embroidered on his badge read, Officer Ethan Blake. Maya's brow furrowed. His demeanor was off, aggressive in a way that went beyond protocol. "Of course," she replied calmly, reaching into her bag for her wallet. As she handed over her documents, she added, "I'm an FBI agent. If you'll allow me a moment, I'll show you my credentials." Blake's eyes flicked to her badge, but his face didn't change. "License and registration," he repeated, ignoring her statement entirely. Maya's grip tightened on the wheel, but she kept her voice steady. "Officer Blake, this is my FBI badge. I'm currently on official duty. If you need verification—" "I said license and registration!" Blake snapped, his voice rising. The sudden escalation drew the attention of a few pedestrians walking by, their heads turning toward the scene. Maya exhaled slowly, her training kicking in. She'd dealt with difficult officers before, but this felt different. The blatant disregard for her authority as a federal agent was unusual and unsettling. She handed him her license and registration, her movements measured and deliberate. Blake barely glanced at the documents before tossing them onto the dashboard. "Step out of the car," he ordered, his voice cold and unyielding. "Excuse me?" Maya's tone was calm, but her surprise was evident. Blake leaned in closer, his hand now fully gripping the holster of his gun. "Are you deaf? I said step out of the car, now!" The air between them grew thick with tension. Maya hesitated. She knew her rights. There was no reason for her to exit the vehicle, especially since she had complied with every request. But she also knew the situation could spiral dangerously out of control if she didn't tread carefully. She took a deep breath and nodded. "All right, officer. I'm complying," she said, her tone measured but firm. Slowly, she opened her car door and stepped out, keeping her hands visible at all times. As she exited, she noticed the crowd of onlookers had grown. Some people were murmuring among themselves, others held up their phones, recording the interaction. The weight of their stares bore down on her, and for the first time, a pang of humiliation surged through her chest. Blake moved toward her and grabbed her arm roughly, yanking her closer to the car. "What are you doing?" Maya protested, her voice firm but laced with disbelief. "Resisting arrest, huh?" Blake sneered, twisting her arm behind her back. "You think you can flash that fancy badge and do whatever you want? Not on my watch." Maya winced as the cold metal of handcuffs clamped tightly around her wrists. The crowd gasped audibly, and the murmurs grew louder. "Officer Blake, this is a mistake," she said, her voice steady despite the fury bubbling inside her. "I'm a federal agent. You're making a serious error." "Shut your mouth," Blake snapped. You think you're above the law because you work for the FBI? Let me tell you something. You're not. Maya's head was spinning, but she kept her posture straight. She had done nothing wrong, and she wasn't going to let this man break her spirit. She locked eyes with one of the bystanders holding a phone and silently hoped that someone would have the courage to report what they were witnessing. Blake dragged her toward his patrol car, his grip unrelenting. Maya glanced back at her sedan, where her briefcase lay in the passenger seat. Inside was the critical evidence she had worked so hard to gather. Her heart sank as she realized she had no way of retrieving it now. As Blake shoved her into the back seat of the cruiser, she caught sight of her reflection in the window. Her face was calm, but her eyes burned with quiet fury. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The door slammed shut, and the car began moving, leaving behind the stunned onlookers and Maya's stranded vehicle. As the cruiser weaved through the streets, Maya took deep breaths, forcing herself to focus. She had faced tougher challenges in her career, but this felt different. This wasn't just about her. It was about something bigger. Her mind raced as she pieced together the clues. Blake's hostility wasn't random. The disdain in his eyes wasn't just about her gender or the color of her skin. It was about control, power, and, she suspected, something far more sinister. As the cruiser sped toward an unfamiliar part of town, Maya's resolve hardened. This wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The drive to the precinct felt endless, each passing second amplifying Maya Carter's simmering anger. From the rear seat of the patrol car, she studied Officer Ethan Blake's rigid posture as he gripped the wheel, his jaw clenched in smug satisfaction. She noted every turn, every landmark, trying to pinpoint where he was taking her. This wasn't a routine stop. She knew that much. The cruiser eventually veered off the main roads and into a less trafficked area, surrounded by industrial warehouses and overgrown lots. The precinct itself was unimpressive, a small, aging building with peeling paint and dim, flickering lights that gave it an ominous air. It was nothing like the sleek and professional FBI field offices she was used to. Blake pulled into the lot, his demeanor unchanged as he yanked the door open and ordered Maya out. "Let's go," he barked, his grip tight around her arm as he escorted her inside. The station was quiet. Too quiet. Only a handful of officers milled about, most avoiding eye contact as Blake dragged Maya through the hallway. She noticed their sidelong glances, their quick retreats into offices, and the heavy silence that followed her steps. It was as if the building itself was complicit in whatever corruption festered within its walls. Blake shoved her into a small interrogation room, the air stale and suffocating. The room was barren except for a metal table and two mismatched chairs. The single fluorescent light overhead flickered intermittently, casting unsettling shadows on the walls. Maya straightened her posture as Blake stepped back, leaning against the doorway with his arms crossed. "You sit tight," he sneered. "The captain will deal with you shortly." Maya didn't reply. Instead, she met his gaze, her silence a statement of defiance. Blake smirked before slamming the door shut, leaving her alone. The minutes ticked by, the room's oppressive stillness pressing down on Maya. She let her mind work, analyzing the situation. Blake's hostility had been blatant, but there was something more deliberate behind it. His refusal to acknowledge her credentials, the unnecessary escalation, and now this remote precinct, it all pointed to a deeper motive. The door finally opened, breaking her train of thought. A tall, broad man with graying hair and a weathered face entered the room. He was dressed in an untucked uniform, his belt weighed down by a sidearm and a pair of handcuffs. "Agent Carter," he began, his tone dripping with mock courtesy. "I'm Captain Rick Grayson, and I oversee this precinct." Maya immediately recognized the authoritative arrogance in his demeanor. Grayson's presence filled the room, but it wasn't with the confidence of a just leader. It was the air of someone accustomed to unchecked power. Grayson dropped a thin manila folder on the table and sat down across from her, his eyes scanning her like a predator sizing up its prey. "Do you know why you're here?" he asked, leaning back casually in his chair. "I'm curious to hear your explanation," Maya replied evenly. Grayson smirked, tapping the folder. "You were caught impersonating a federal agent. That's a serious offense." Maya arched an eyebrow. "I am a federal agent. My credentials are valid and any database can confirm that. Or do you not have access to such resources here?" His smirk faltered briefly, but he recovered. "Don't get smart with me. You might flash a badge around, but I don't see proof you're who you say you are." "I see. So Officer Blake's word is all you need to justify this baseless detention?" Maya asked, her voice calm but cutting. Grayson's eyes narrowed. "Careful, Agent Carter. You're not in a position to make demands." Maya leaned forward slightly, meeting his gaze. "Neither are you, Captain. And when my team finds out about this, I assure you, it won't end well for you or Officer Blake." Grayson's face hardened, and for a moment Maya thought he might lash out. Instead, he stood abruptly, scooping up the folder. "We'll see about that," he muttered before walking to the door. The next hour passed in silence, but Maya's ears were keenly attuned to the sounds outside the room. She heard muffled voices, Grayson and Blake, their tones hushed but heated. She strained to make out their words, catching fragments. "Securing our interests." "The FBI sniffing around?" She's seen too much. Her suspicions crystallized. This wasn't just about a traffic stop or an arrogant cop flexing his power. Blake and Grayson were involved in something far bigger, and her investigation had brought her too close to the truth. The door opened again, this time admitting a young officer with short-cropped brown hair and a nervous expression. His name tag read Deputy Claire Morales. She carried a small notepad and avoided direct eye contact as she stepped inside. "I need to ask you some questions," Morales said, her voice soft but professional. Maya studied her closely. Morales's posture was rigid, her movements tentative. Unlike Blake and Grayson, she didn't radiate hostility, but there was an undercurrent of unease. "I'll answer your questions once I'm informed of the charges against me," Maya replied. Morales hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the one-way mirror on the wall. She knew she was being watched. "Look," Morales began, lowering her voice slightly. "Just answer a few questions. It'll make things easier." "For whom?" Maya countered. The deputy didn't reply, her pen poised over the notepad. Maya leaned back, her voice softening. "You're not comfortable with this, are you?" Morales froze, her gaze snapping to Maya's face. "Listen," Maya continued, her tone steady but firm. "Whatever you think you're protecting here, it's not worth it. Grayson and Blake are hiding something, and if you stay silent, you're complicit." Morales's eyes darted toward the mirror again. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said stiffly, but her shaky voice betrayed her. Before Maya could press further, the door opened again, and Blake stormed in. "That's enough," he barked, glaring at Morales. "Go file your report." Morales hesitated, glancing between Maya and Blake before nodding and exiting the room. As the door closed, Blake loomed over Maya, his smirk back in place. "You think you're smart, don't you? Flashing that badge, trying to scare us." Maya remained silent, her expression unflinching. "Well, guess what?" Blake leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You're nothing here, and when this is over, you'll wish you never set foot in this precinct." Maya held his gaze, refusing to let him intimidate her. Inside, her resolve only grew stronger. Whatever Grayson and Blake were hiding, she was going to uncover it, and she wouldn't let them break her in the process. Blake finally straightened, his smirk fading as he slammed the door behind him. Maya exhaled slowly, her mind racing. She didn't know how yet, but she was going to turn this situation around. As the faint sound of Blake and Grayson's voices filtered through the walls, Maya's sharp ears picked up another fragment. "She won't leave here alive if she digs any deeper." Maya's jaw clenched. The game had changed. The door to the interrogation room opened again, and a younger officer with nervous energy stepped inside. His name tag read Dylan Price, and while his uniform was crisp and his posture upright, there was a hint of hesitance in his every movement. His eyes flicked toward Maya, then away, as though he was unsure how to address her. He carried a clipboard in one hand, a small electronic device in the other. He cleared his throat, his voice quiet but steady. "I need to process you for holding," he said. Maya studied him closely, her sharp instincts picking up on his discomfort. Unlike Blake and Grayson, Price didn't exude hostility. Instead, he seemed like someone caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, following orders he wasn't entirely comfortable with. "Of course," Maya said, her tone calm but probing. "You're just doing your job, right?" Price glanced at the one-way mirror, then back at Maya. "Yes, ma'am. Just standard procedure." Maya raised an eyebrow. "Standard, huh? Is it standard to detain an FBI agent without cause?" Price's grip on the clipboard tightened, but he didn't respond. He pulled a chair across from her, his movements deliberate as he began filling out forms. Maya noticed the slight tremor in his hands, and the way his eyes darted nervously between her and the door. "Officer Price," she began, leaning forward slightly. "I know you don't want to be here any more than I do. Whatever Blake and Grayson are doing, you know it's wrong." Price stiffened, his pen hovering over the clipboard. "I don't make the rules," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. "No," Maya said gently, "but you get to decide whether you follow orders that you know are illegal." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, Maya thought he might snap at her. Instead, he looked down, scribbling something on the form in front of him. The silence in the room grew heavier, the tension palpable. Price's internal struggle was evident as he worked through the motions of processing Maya. He asked her for basic information, name, date of birth, address, but his voice lacked the authority that usually accompanied such questions. Maya answered calmly, her tone steady but firm, never letting go of the opportunity to plant seeds of doubt in his mind. "Do you know why I'm here, Officer Price?" she asked after a long pause. Price hesitated, his pen pausing mid-scribble. "They said you were impersonating a federal agent." "And you believe that?" Maya pressed. His silence spoke volumes. Blake burst into the room without warning, the door slamming against the wall with a force that made Price flinch. The officer's smug grin returned as he leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed. "How's our guest doing?" Blake asked, his tone dripping with mock politeness. "Just finishing up," Price said, his voice quieter than before. Blake's eyes shifted to Maya, his expression hardening. "You've got some nerve, Agent Carter, sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. Did you think we wouldn't notice?" Maya met his glare with unflinching resolve. "Notice what, Officer Blake? That I was doing my job?" Blake scoffed, shaking his head. "Your job, huh? Is that what you call it? Snooping around, sticking your badge in places it shouldn't be?" Maya tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You sound nervous, officer. Did I find something you didn't want me to?" Blake's smirk faltered, just for a second, before he recovered. "Careful, Agent. You're not as untouchable as you think." He stepped closer to Price, clapping a hand on the younger officer's shoulder. "Make sure you log everything, Price, especially her phone. I'm sure it's got all kinds of interesting things on it." Maya's stomach dropped. Her phone. It contained critical evidence from her investigation, files, photos, and recordings that could connect Grayson, and possibly even Blake, to the crime syndicate. If they gained access to it, months of work could be destroyed. Blake noticed the flicker of concern in her eyes and grinned. "What's the matter, Agent? Got something to hide?" Maya's voice was calm, but there was an edge of steel beneath it. "Tampering with evidence is a federal offense, Officer Blake. I'd think carefully before you cross that line." Blake leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You think anyone here cares about your rules? This is my precinct. My rules." After Blake left, Price seemed even more uneasy, his hands shaking slightly as he packed up his clipboard and electronic device. Maya watched him closely, her mind racing. "Officer Price," she said, her voice low but firm. "If they access my phone, they'll destroy evidence tied to a federal investigation. I don't need to tell you how serious that is." Price hesitated, his gaze flicking to the door. I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," Maya countered. "You know what they're doing here is wrong. You're not like them, Price. You don't have to be a part of this." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a brief moment, Maya saw the conflict in his eyes. "I don't have a choice," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Grayson runs this place. If I cross him—" "You do have a choice," Maya interrupted. "You can choose to do the right thing, or you can choose to stay silent and let them get away with it. But if you think staying silent will protect you, you're wrong. People like Blake and Grayson don't care about loyalty. They'll throw you under the bus the second it suits them." Price's jaw tightened, his internal struggle written all over his face. Later that evening, Maya remained in the holding cell, her thoughts swirling as she tried to piece together her next move. She couldn't count on anyone to save her. Not yet. She needed to find a way to protect the evidence and expose Blake and Grayson's corruption. When Price returned to the cell, his expression was more serious than before. He opened the slot in the door, sliding a small slip of paper through. Maya picked it up and unfolded it. It was blank, except for a single, hastily scrawled word. Phone. Her eyes flicked up to Price, whose expression was unreadable. He nodded once before turning and walking away, leaving Maya with a faint glimmer of hope. Meanwhile, in Grayson's office, Blake held Maya's phone, scrolling through the files with a growing sense of dread. The evidence she had collected was damning, implicating not only the precinct but also powerful figures tied to the syndicate. "We need to wipe this," Blake muttered, his voice laced with urgency. "If this gets out, we're finished." Grayson's expression darkened. "Do it now." Blake plugged the phone into a nearby computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard. But just as he prepared to delete the files, an error message flashed on the screen. "Files encrypted. Password required." Blake cursed under his breath, his frustration mounting. "We'll get her to unlock it," Grayson said, his tone cold. "One way or another." Back in the cell, Maya sat in silence, clutching the slip of paper as she prepared herself for what was to come. She knew the fight was far from over, but one thing was clear. The cracks in Blake and Grayson's control were starting to show. The dim light in the holding cell flickered as Maya paced the small space, her mind racing. Dylan Price's message had been cryptic but clear. He intended to help. Whether he was driven by guilt or a sense of justice, Maya wasn't sure, but she knew this was the opening she needed. Time was running out. Blake and Grayson's determination to destroy her evidence and likely her credibility was evident. The muffled sound of footsteps outside her cell jolted her from her thoughts. The steps were hesitant but purposeful, and she immediately recognized the gate. The slot in the door slid open, and Price's face appeared, his expression serious. "Are you ready?" he whispered, glancing over his shoulder nervously. Maya stepped closer, lowering her voice. "What's the plan?" Price hesitated, his internal conflict evident. "I'll unlock the door, but we have to move quickly. Grayson and Blake are distracted in the office, but they won't be for long." "What about the cameras?" Maya asked. "They're conveniently malfunctioning," Price replied, a small nervous smile breaking through his otherwise tense expression. "I might have had something to do with that." Maya nodded, her respect for the young officer growing. He wasn't just helping. He was actively defying the power structure that had kept him complicit for so long. The cell door creaked as it opened, and Maya stepped out, her heart pounding. The hallways were eerily quiet, lit by the occasional flicker of fluorescent lights. "Follow me," Price murmured, leading her down a side corridor. He moved quickly but cautiously, checking each corner before proceeding. Maya stayed close behind, her senses on high alert. They reached a locked door near the far end of the precinct, and Price fumbled with his keys, his hands trembling slightly. "What's in there?" Maya whispered. "Grayson's office," Price replied. "You said you needed evidence. I can't promise much, but I saw a file on his desk earlier. It had your name on it." Maya's pulse quickened. This could be the break she needed, but the risk was enormous. The door clicked open and they slipped inside. Grayson's office was dimly lit, the desk cluttered with papers and folders. A safe sat in the corner, its digital keypad blinking faintly. "You keep watch," Maya instructed, her voice firm but quiet. Price nodded and stationed himself by the door, his eyes scanning the hallway. Maya moved swiftly, her trained eyes darting across the desk. Most of the documents were routine, arrest reports, precinct budgets, but a manila folder tucked beneath a pile of papers caught her attention. She pulled it free, her heart racing as she flipped it open. Inside were partially redacted memos and emails, many of which referenced payments and operations tied to an unknown organization. One name stood out: Atlas Group. It was vague but familiar, an entity she had encountered in her investigation of the crime syndicate. She skimmed further, her breath catching as she found a cryptic list of initials alongside coded messages. The implications were damning. Grayson and Blake weren't just small-time corrupt cops, they were part of a much larger operation. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, and Price turned sharply. "We need to go!" he hissed, his voice tight with urgency. Maya tucked the folder under her arm and nodded. "Let's move." As they navigated their way through the precinct, the tension was suffocating. Every shadow felt like a threat, every distant noise like an impending ambush. They reached the back exit just as an alarm blared, its shrill sound slicing through the silence. "They know," Price said, panic creeping into his voice. "Stay calm," Maya instructed. She pushed open the door, and they slipped out into the cold night air. The precinct was bordered by a dense forest, its trees casting long shadows under the dim glow of a nearby streetlight. "We'll head into the woods," Maya said, already moving. "They'll expect us to stick to the roads. The forest gives us cover." Price hesitated for only a moment before following her. The alarm's wail was soon joined by the sound of shouting voices and slamming doors. Maya glanced back to see Blake and Morales emerging from the precinct, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. "Fan out!" Blake barked. "They're not getting far." Maya quickened her pace, the forest's dense underbrush snagging at her clothes as she and Price pushed deeper into the woods. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, but Maya's FBI training kicked in. "Stay low," she instructed, her voice a whisper. "And step where I step. Don't make unnecessary noise." Price nodded, his face pale but determined. The forest was a labyrinth of shadows and sounds. Maya moved with purpose, her eyes scanning for natural cover. She spotted a fallen tree with thick branches and motioned for Price to follow her behind it. "We'll wait here," she whispered, crouching low. The beams of flashlights danced through the trees, accompanied by the crunch of boots on leaves. Blake's voice carried through the night. "Carter!" he shouted, his tone venomous. "You think you can run? This ends tonight!" Maya's jaw tightened, her mind racing. She needed to create a diversion, something to throw them off their trail. She spotted a cluster of rocks nearby and quickly gathered a handful. With precise aim, she tossed one toward a distant thicket. The sound of the rock hitting the underbrush was faint, but enough to draw the flashlights in that direction. "They went that way!" one of the officers called. The pursuers shifted course, their voices fading slightly as they moved toward the distraction. Maya motioned for Price to follow her as she led them deeper into the woods. The terrain grew steeper, the ground uneven and littered with fallen branches. Price stumbled but caught himself, his breathing heavy. "How much farther?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Far enough that they lose our trail," Maya replied. They pressed on, the forest growing darker with each step. The sounds of pursuit grew distant, but Maya knew better than to let her guard down. Hours seemed to pass as they moved through the woods, the cold air biting at their skin. Finally, they came upon a small clearing. Maya paused, scanning the area. "We'll rest here," she said. Price sank to the ground, his exhaustion evident. "Do you think they'll give up?" Maya shook her head. "Not Blake. He's too invested. But we've bought ourselves some time." She pulled out the manila folder, flipping through its contents under the faint light of the moon. The information was fragmented but damning. The Atlas Group was a powerful entity with connections that extended far beyond the precinct. "We need to get this to my team," Maya said, her voice resolute. Price looked up at her, his expression a mix of fear and admiration. "You really think you can take them down?" Maya met his gaze. "I don't just think it, I know it." The respite was short-lived. The faint sound of barking dogs reached their ears, and Maya's heart sank. "They've brought K9 units," she said grimly. Price's face paled. "What do we do?" Maya's mind worked quickly. "We keep moving, and this time, we set traps." As they moved, Maya used her knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. She identified weak branches to create noise traps, scattered rocks to mislead their pursuers, and used the dense underbrush to obscure their trail. The barking grew louder, the beams of flashlights piercing the darkness once again. Maya's heart pounded, but her resolve remained unshaken. "This way," she whispered, leading Price toward a narrow ravine. They descended carefully, the steep slope offering natural cover. Maya glanced back, her sharp eyes catching the movement of shadows at the ridge above. Blake's voice rang out, furious and determined. "Don't let them get away." The chase continued through the night, a relentless game of cat and mouse. Maya and Price narrowly evaded capture multiple times, their pursuers growing more desperate with each passing hour. As dawn began to break, the forest's shadows lifted slightly, revealing the extent of their journey. Exhausted but determined, Maya led Price to a secluded stream. "We'll regroup here," she said, her voice steady despite the strain in her body. Price nodded, his admiration for Maya evident. "How do you stay so calm?" he asked. Maya allowed herself a faint smile. "Because I have to. If I let fear take over, they win." As the morning light filtered through the trees, Maya's resolve only grew stronger. Blake and Grayson had underestimated her, and that would be their downfall. The chase wasn't over, but Maya was ready. The faint light of dawn filtered through the dense canopy above, casting pale shadows on the forest floor. Maya and Officer Dylan Price trudged through the underbrush, their bodies aching from the relentless chase. Every sound, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, felt amplified in the tense silence that hung between them. Maya scanned the horizon, her sharp eyes catching the outline of a structure in the distance. "There," she said, nodding toward the dilapidated cabin nestled among the trees. Price squinted, his breath visible in the chilly morning air. "Looks abandoned." "Exactly what we need," Maya replied, picking up her pace. The cabin, an old hunting lodge, stood like a relic of another era. Its wooden exterior was weathered and cracked, the windows clouded with grime. As they approached, Maya tested the door, which creaked loudly as it swung open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. Dust motes floated in the shafts of light streaming through the broken windows. The room was sparse, with only a rickety table and a few mismatched chairs scattered about. "We'll rest here," Maya said, setting the manila folder she had recovered onto the table. Price hesitated, his eyes scanning the shadows that seemed to loom larger in the confined space. "Are you sure this is safe?" "It's as safe as we're going to get for now," Maya replied, her tone brooking no argument. As Price slumped into a chair, Maya spread the contents of the folder across the table. Her fingers moved quickly, sorting through the partially redacted documents and fragmented data. "The Atlas Group," she murmured, her brow furrowed. "This isn't just a local operation. Grayson and Blake are pawns in something much bigger." Price leaned forward, his eyes flicking over the papers. "What do you mean?" Maya tapped one of the documents, her voice low but intense. "These transactions, payments routed through shell companies tied to government contracts. Someone powerful is protecting this syndicate and Grayson is their middleman." Price exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. "How do we stop this? They've got resources, connections. We expose them, Maya cut in, piece by piece. This ledger is just the start. Her voice was calm, but her mind was already racing ahead, strategizing. The sound of snapping branches outside brought them both to attention. Maya held up a hand, signaling for silence. She moved to the window, peering out into the dense forest. Two figures emerged from the trees. Blake, his posture rigid with determination, and Morales, her movements hesitant, almost reluctant. "They've found us," Price whispered, his voice taut with fear. Maya turned back to him, her expression resolute. "Stay calm. We're not cornered yet." Blake's voice rang out, breaking the morning stillness. "Carter, you're just making this harder on yourself. Come out now, and maybe we'll go easy on you." Maya smirked, her mind already formulating a plan. She motioned for Price to stay low and moved to position herself near the door. "Blake," she called out, her voice steady and unyielding. "You're awfully confident for someone who's about to go down." Blake's laugh was sharp and humorless. "You think you've got the upper hand? You're surrounded, Carter. It's over." "Is it?" Maya countered. "Because from where I'm standing, you look like a desperate man covering up for his corrupt boss." Her words struck a nerve. She heard Blake mutter something to Morales, his tone sharp and irritated. As the minutes dragged on, Maya continued to engage Blake, her voice cutting through the tense air like a blade. "What's the matter, officer?" she called. "Grayson's promises starting to unravel?" "You don't know what you're talking about," Blake snapped, but there was a crack in his confidence. "Don't I?" Maya pressed, her tone taunting. "You think Grayson's going to protect you when this all comes crashing down? You're expendable, Blake. Just another cog in their machine." Inside the cabin, Price shifted uncomfortably. "Are you sure antagonizing him is a good idea?" Maya's expression was steely. "Psychological pressure, it'll make him reckless." Outside, Blake's patience wore thin. "Enough of this!" he barked. "Morales, stay here. I'll handle her myself." Maya tensed as the heavy crunch of Blake's boots approached the cabin. She motioned for Price to move to the corner, keeping himself out of sight. The door burst open, and Blake stormed in, his gun drawn. His eyes landed on Maya, who stood calmly by the table, her hands raised slightly in a show of mock surrender. "Drop the act," Blake growled. "This ends now." "Does it?" Maya asked, her voice calm and measured. "Because you seem awfully nervous for someone who's in control." Blake's hand tightened around the grip of his weapon. "You don't know when to shut up, do you?" Maya's eyes flicked to the papers on the table, drawing his attention. "I know enough," she said, her tone cutting. "Like how Grayson is skimming off the top, keeping his cut while the syndicate pulls the strings." Blake's face darkened, a flicker of doubt crossing his features. "You didn't know, did you?" Maya continued, her voice soft but relentless. "You thought you were on the inside, but you're just a pawn like the rest," Blake snapped, lunging toward her. Maya sidestepped, grabbing a broken chair leg from the table and swinging it with precision. The makeshift weapon caught Blake's arm, knocking his gun to the floor. The two grappled, their movements fast and brutal. Maya's FBI training gave her the edge, but Blake's raw strength made him a formidable opponent. Outside, Morales hesitated as she heard the commotion inside. Her hand hovered over her holstered weapon, her expression conflicted. "Morales!" Blake shouted, his voice tinged with desperation. "Get in here!" Morales took a step forward, but froze, her mind racing. The past few days had chipped away at her loyalty to Blake and Grayson, and now, faced with the chaos inside the cabin, she hesitated. Maya managed to break free, grabbing the ledger from the table and swinging it like a shield as Blake charged again. They collided, the momentum sending them crashing into the wall. Blake snarled, his strength faltering as Maya landed a sharp elbow to his ribs. She grabbed the broken chair leg again, raising it like a baton. "This is over, Blake," she said, her voice firm. Blake's glare faltered, his chest heaving. He glanced toward the door, where Morales still stood frozen. "Do something!" he barked at her. Morales' hand dropped from her weapon, her expression resolute. "I think she's right," she said softly. Blake's face contorted with rage. "You're making a mistake." "No," Morales replied, her voice steadying. "You did." Maya used the distraction to her advantage, delivering a decisive blow that sent Blake sprawling to the floor. She grabbed his weapon, ensuring he couldn't retaliate. The room fell silent except for the sound of heavy breathing. Morales stepped inside, her hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "I'm not here to fight," she said, her eyes meeting Maya's. I can't be part of this anymore." Maya studied her for a moment before nodding. "Then help me finish this." The cabin, once a place of tension and fear, now felt like the turning point Maya had been fighting for. With Morales' defection and Blake subdued, the tide was finally shifting. But Maya knew this was just the beginning. Grayson and the syndicate were still out there, and the battle was far from over. The sun had begun its slow ascent, casting faint rays of light over the forest canopy. The stillness outside the cabin was broken only by the muffled sounds of Blake struggling against the restraints Maya had fashioned from a torn belt and a length of frayed rope. He glared at her from his spot on the floor, his face flushed with anger. "You're making a big mistake, Carter," Blake growled, his voice dripping with venom. Maya didn't flinch. She stood over him, her posture commanding despite the fatigue etched into her features. "The only mistake I made was underestimating how deep your corruption runs. That ends now." Morales sat in the corner of the room, her gaze fixed on the floor. Her hand trembled as it hovered near her weapon, but she didn't draw it. Price returned from the window, his face pale but determined. "I saw headlights cutting through the trees. They're coming this way." Maya's heart leapt, a mix of relief and urgency coursing through her. "FBI?" "Could be," Price said, "but if it's Grayson—" Maya didn't need him to finish the thought. She looked to Morales, her voice sharper than before. "If you're with me, now's the time to decide. We need every ally we can get." Morales hesitated, her internal struggle visible in her furrowed brow and clenched fists. Finally, she nodded, her voice barely audible. "I'll do what I can." The sound of engines grew louder, breaking through the quiet tension in the cabin. Maya positioned herself near the window, her trained eyes scanning the dirt road that led toward the clearing. A line of dark SUVs came into view, their tinted windows gleaming in the pale light. "It's them," Maya confirmed, recognizing the unmarked vehicles of her FBI team. Moments later, the first vehicle skidded to a halt, and the doors swung open. Maya's heart lifted at the sight of her colleague, Special Agent Jackson, stepping out, his presence as steadying as a lighthouse in a storm. "Maya," he called, his hand raised in a gesture of reassurance. Maya stepped out of the cabin, her hands raised to show she was unarmed. Price and Morales followed, more hesitant but equally visible. Jackson approached quickly, his eyes scanning her for injuries. "Are you okay? We got your message. Barely. What's the situation?" "Blake's inside," Maya said, her voice calm but urgent. "He's restrained. Grayson, he's still out there." Jackson's jaw tightened. "We'll handle Blake. What about the evidence?" Maya handed him the manila folder, her voice firm. "This is just the beginning. Grayson and the Atlas Group are operating a network bigger than anything we've dealt with. We need to move fast before they cover their tracks." Inside the cabin, Blake's bravado began to crumble as FBI agents entered, their weapons trained on him. He sneered, but his eyes betrayed his growing fear. "You think this changes anything?" he spat as Jackson ordered his men to secure him. "You're just scratching the surface." Maya leaned down, her expression steely. "Then it's time we dig deeper." As Blake was hauled out, Price stepped forward, his face pale but resolute. "I have information," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Grayson, he's been taking payments, falsifying reports, covering up everything. I can testify." Jackson turned to him, his sharp gaze appraising the young officer. "And who are you?" "Dylan Price," Maya said, answering for him. "A precinct officer. He risked everything to help me get here." Jackson gave a curt nod. "We'll debrief him later. For now, we need to secure this location and track Grayson." The scene outside the cabin was a blur of activity. FBI agents swarmed the area, searching for clues and setting up a perimeter. Maya stood with Jackson, her mind racing even as her body begged for rest. "Grayson won't go far," Jackson said. "He knows the forest better than we do, but he's running out of places to hide." Maya nodded. "He's scared. That makes him dangerous. We can't let him regroup with the syndicate." "We won't," Jackson said firmly. Morales lingered near one of the SUVs, her expression conflicted. She avoided Maya's gaze, her shoulders hunched as if the weight of her decisions had finally caught up to her. Maya approached slowly, her voice softer than before. "You've got a choice to make, Morales. You can keep hiding, or you can help us stop this." Morales glanced up, her eyes filled with guilt. I didn't know how bad it was. I thought—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "I don't know what to do." "You start by telling the truth," Maya said. "Everything you know about Grayson, Blake, and their operations. It's not too late to do the right thing." Morales hesitated, then gave a small nod. "I'll think about it." As the morning wore on, the FBI agents prepared to transport Blake back to headquarters. Maya stood by, her exhaustion evident, but her resolve unwavering. Jackson approached, his expression serious. "You did good, Maya, but this isn't over." "I know," she replied. "Grayson's still out there, and the Atlas Group isn't going to back down quietly." Jackson nodded, then handed her a sealed envelope. "This came for you while we were en route. Thought you'd want to see it." Maya frowned, taking the envelope. She opened it carefully, her breath catching as she read the single typed line. "You're in too deep, Agent Carter. They'll come for you next." Her pulse quickened, but she folded the note and slipped it into her pocket, her face unreadable. "What is it?" Jackson asked. "Nothing I didn't already know," Maya said, her voice steady. As the SUVs pulled away, carrying Blake and the evidence, Maya stood in the clearing, her mind racing with possibilities. Price approached hesitantly, his expression filled with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. "What happens now?" he asked. Maya turned to him, her gaze firm. "Now? We keep going. Grayson won't stop, and neither will we." Price nodded, a flicker of determination crossing his face. Maya's eyes shifted to the horizon, where the forest seemed to stretch endlessly. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time in days, she felt like she had the upper hand. The syndicate had made a mistake by coming after her, and she intended to make them regret it. The fluorescent lights in the FBI headquarters were harsh against the sterile walls of the debriefing room. Maya Carter sat at the long table, her body aching from exhaustion, but her mind razor-sharp. Across from her, Special Agent Jackson leaned back in his chair, a thick file open in front of him. "You've had quite the week," Jackson said, his tone somewhere between admiration and concern. Maya allowed herself a faint smirk. "You could say that." Jackson glanced at the documents spread across the table. "The ledger you recovered is damning, but it's only the tip of the iceberg. We've launched an internal inquiry into the precinct, and what we're finding—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Let's just say Blake wasn't the only one with dirty hands." Maya nodded, though the weight of it all settled heavily on her shoulders. "What about Grayson?" Jackson's jaw tightened. "Still at large. We've got teams scouring the area, but he's slippery. It's clear he's not working alone." Maya leaned forward, her voice firm. "He's tied to the Atlas Group. The ledger proves it. If we dismantle their network, we'll flush him out." Jackson studied her for a moment before nodding. "We're assigning additional resources to the case. But you—" He paused, his tone softening. "You've been through hell, Maya. Take some time to recover." "I can't afford to," Maya said, her voice unyielding. "This isn't just about me. It's about every person Grayson and the Atlas Group have hurt. I'm not backing down." Later that evening, Maya returned to her office. The space felt eerily quiet, the chaos of the past days replaced by an almost unsettling calm. She sank into her chair, staring at the stack of reports and evidence files on her desk. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. She picked it up, her heart softening slightly at the name on the screen, Aunt Evelyn. "Maya," Evelyn's warm voice greeted her, tinged with concern. "I saw the news. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Aunt Ev," Maya said, her voice softening. "Just tired." "You've been carrying so much on your shoulders," Evelyn said gently. "Don't forget you're not alone in this." Maya closed her eyes, the words sinking in. "I know," she said quietly. "Thanks, Aunt Ev." The next day, Maya met with her team to strategize their next steps. Price was there, standing nervously near the edge of the conference room, his hands shoved into his pockets. "You're sure about this?" Maya asked, raising an eyebrow at him. Price straightened, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I want to help. I know I've got a lot to prove, but I'm done looking the other way." Maya studied him for a long moment before nodding. "All right, Officer Price. Welcome to the team." The meeting was intense, the air thick with determination as Maya and her colleagues dissected the ledger. Names, dates, transactions, all pointing to a sprawling web of corruption that extended far beyond Grayson's precinct. One name stood out, underlined in red ink on the whiteboard. Atlas Group. "This isn't just a crime syndicate," Maya said, her voice cutting through the room. "It's an empire. And if we don't dismantle it piece by piece, they'll keep growing." Jackson leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Grayson is the key. If we can bring him in, he'll lead us to the higher-ups." "But he knows that," Maya countered. "He'll do everything he can to stay hidden. We need to outthink him." In the weeks that followed, the FBI's inquiry into the precinct revealed a shocking level of corruption. Reports of falsified arrests, embezzlement, and collusion with the Atlas Group painted a grim picture. Several officers were suspended, and warrants were issued for others who had fled. The public response was swift and unforgiving. News outlets ran stories about the precinct's downfall, and protests erupted in the community, demanding accountability. Maya attended one such protest, standing quietly in the crowd as speakers called for justice. An elderly woman approached her, her eyes bright with determination. "Agent Carter?" the woman asked. Maya nodded, surprised. "Thank you," the woman said, her voice trembling, "for standing up for us, for not giving up." Maya's throat tightened, and she managed a small smile. I'm just doing my job. Price, too, began to find his footing. Under Maya's guidance, he started providing valuable intel on the precinct's inner workings. He worked tirelessly, combing through old records and connecting dots that had long been buried. One evening, as they pored over yet another stack of documents, Price hesitated. Maya, he said, his voice uncertain. She looked up, her expression patient. What is it? I wanted to say, I'm sorry, he said, his words tumbling out, for being part of the system that let this happen, for not speaking up sooner. Maya studied him, her gaze steady. What matters is that you're speaking up now. We can't change the past, but we can fight for a better future. Price nodded, the weight of her words settling on him. Despite the progress, there were moments of doubt. Late at night, alone in her apartment, Maya often found herself replaying the events in her mind. The chase, the confrontation with Blake, the cryptic warning, it all felt like a storm that had yet to pass. She stared at the note Jackson had handed her, the words etched into her memory. You're in too deep, Agent Carter. They'll come for you next. The Atlas Group was watching, and Maya knew the fight was far from over. As the weeks turned into months, Maya and her team began piecing together the syndicate's network. Each breakthrough brought them closer to the truth, but it also brought new challenges. Grayson remained elusive, and the Atlas Group's reach was broader than they had anticipated. But Maya refused to let the enormity of the task deter her. With Price by her side and her colleagues rallying behind her, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. One afternoon, Morales arrived at Maya's office, her expression hesitant. Agent Carter, she began, her voice quiet. I've been thinking about what you said. Maya set down the report she'd been reading, giving Morales her full attention. And? Morales took a deep breath. I want to help. I know I've been complicit, but I want to make things right. Maya nodded, her respect for Morales growing. Then let's get to work. As the chapter closed, Maya stood on the precipice of a new battle. The Atlas Group was still out there, their power vast and their influence insidious. But she wasn't alone. With her team by her side and the community rallying behind her, Maya felt ready to face whatever came next. This wasn't just about taking down a syndicate. It was about rebuilding trust in the system, in each other, and in the fight for justice. Maya Carter walked briskly through the halls of the FBI headquarters, her heels echoing on the tiled floors. The air around her buzzed with a new energy, a sense of urgency as the investigation into the Atlas Group gained momentum. Every step brought her closer to the answers she sought, but with each new discovery came a darker understanding of the forces she was up against. She entered the operations room, where her team was gathered around a large digital display showing a web of connections tied to the syndicate. Names, photos, and documents flickered across the screen as they pieced together the sprawling network. All right, Maya said, her voice cutting through the chatter. Where are we on the financial trail? Special Agent Jackson stepped forward, a stack of papers in hand. We've tracked several payments from the shell companies in the ledger. They lead to offshore accounts, but the paper trail ends there. Whoever's running this knows how to cover their tracks. Maya frowned, her mind racing. What about Grayson? Any sign of him? Jackson shook his head. He's gone to ground. Our sources say he's still in the state, but he's being careful. We'll find him, though. Later that day, Maya sat in her office reviewing the fragments of evidence they'd gathered. The pieces were starting to form a picture, but it was still incomplete. She leaned back in her chair, the weight of the investigation pressing heavily on her shoulders. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Price, his expression uncertain. Got a minute? He asked. Maya gestured for him to sit. What's on your mind? Price hesitated, then leaned forward, his voice low. I've been going through the precinct's old files. I found something strange. He handed her a folder, and Maya flipped it open. Inside were records of arrests and case reports, all signed off by one of her colleagues, Agent Paul Brenner. What am I looking at? Maya asked, her tone wary. These cases, Price explained. They're tied to Atlas Group operations, but they don't go anywhere. The suspects were released, the evidence disappeared. It's like someone was protecting them. Maya's stomach turned. Brenner's been with the Bureau for years. Are you saying he's compromised? Price nodded grimly. It looks that way. The revelation hit Maya hard. Brenner had been a trusted ally, someone she'd worked alongside on countless cases. If he was involved with the Atlas Group, it meant their reach extended further than she'd realized. She decided to confront him directly. That evening, she found Brenner in one of the conference rooms, reviewing case files. Paul, Maya began, her tone careful. Got a minute? Brenner looked up, his smile warm but guarded. Of course. What's up? Maya closed the door behind her, her gaze steady. I need to ask you about these. She placed the folder on the table, watching his reaction closely. Brenner's smile faltered as he flipped through the documents. What's this about? You tell me, Maya said, her voice firm. These cases all lead back to the Atlas Group, and your name is on every one of them. Brenner leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. You think I'm involved with them? I think you owe me an explanation, Maya replied. For a moment, silence hung heavy between them. Then Brenner leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. You have no idea what you're dealing with, Carter, he said, his voice low. The Atlas Group isn't just another syndicate. They're everywhere. And if you keep digging, you're going to get yourself killed. Maya's blood ran cold. So it's true. You're working for them. Brenner didn't deny it. Instead, he stood, gathering the folder. Walk away, Maya. This isn't a fight you can win. As Brenner left the room, Maya's mind raced. The betrayal stung deeply, but it also confirmed her worst fears. The Atlas Group had infiltrated the bureau. She returned to her office, locking the door behind her. She needed to think, to plan her next move. She couldn't trust anyone, not even those she'd once considered allies. The following day, Maya received a tip from an informant about a warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a location tied to the Atlas Group's operations. It's risky, Jackson warned as they reviewed the intel. If this is a setup, we don't have a choice, Maya said. If there's even a chance this lead is real, we have to act on it. That night, Maya and a small team approached the warehouse under cover of darkness. The building loomed ominously, its windows boarded up and its perimeter eerily quiet. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of oil and metal. Crates and barrels were stacked haphazardly, and the faint hum of machinery echoed in the distance. Maya's flashlight swept across the room, landing on a desk piled with papers. She moved quickly, scanning the documents for anything useful. Her heart raced as she found a map marked with several locations, along with a list of names, prominent figures tied to the syndicate. This is it, she whispered. This is what we need. But before she could act, the sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse. Maya's head snapped up, her instincts kicking in. The ambush was swift and brutal. Shadows moved between the crates, and the flash of a weapon's barrel caught her eye. Get down! Maya shouted, diving behind a stack of barrels as gunfire erupted. Her team returned fire, the warehouse erupting into chaos. Maya clutched the map and list tightly, knowing it was their key to taking down the syndicate. But the attackers were relentless, and one by one, her team was forced to retreat. As the gunfire died down, Maya found herself alone, the document still clutched in her hand. She moved cautiously, her heart pounding. But just as she reached the exit, a figure stepped into her path. Going somewhere? Grayson's voice was cold, his gun trained on her. Maya froze, her mind racing. Grayson, you're making a mistake. No, he said, a smirk playing on his lips. You did, Carter. You should have walked away when you had the chance. Before Maya could react, a sharp pain exploded at the back of her head, and the world went black. When Maya came to, she was bound to a chair in a dimly lit room. Grayson stood before her, the map and list spread out on the table beside him. You've been a thorn in our side for too long, he said, his voice filled with contempt. Maya's vision blurred, but her resolve remained unbroken. You think this ends with me? She said, her voice hoarse. You're wrong, Grayson laughed. We'll see about that. As the story closes with Maya's fate hanging in the balance, let's take a moment to reflect on everything that's unfolded so far. What would you do if someone you trusted turned out to be working against you? Do you believe Maya will find a way to escape and expose the Atlas Group? Or has the syndicate's reach finally outmatched her? And perhaps the most pressing question, how far would you go to stand up for justice, even when the odds seem impossible? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's discuss where this journey might take us next. Your insights could inspire the next chapter of Maya's fight for truth and justice.